soon to have a backup. And so then we can go through the consent process. And I sent you this ahead of time. I don't know if you had a chance to read it, but I guess to start though, will you state your name and affiliation?
So my name is Joe Rittberger, and I am at the University of Oklahoma. I'm an assistant professor of political science.
Thanks. So for the consent, you're invited to participate in this study about disaster research perspectives on COVID-19, led by Liesl Ritchie. The protocols for the study have been approved by the Institutional Review Board at Oklahoma State University as well as at the University of Kansas. Your participation is voluntary, and there's no penalty for refusal to participate, and you're free to withdraw your consent at any time, also without penalty. If you do agree to participate, we ask that you do this interview with us that we expect to take approximately 60 minutes, and then one subsequent interview within the next 12 months to follow up on some of your comments made today. There's no compensation for the study, and unless you request otherwise, the information you give will not be anonymous. So that means that your comments will be attributed to you. And but we think that this means your participation in the study involves work similar to a researcher's daily activities. So with that, do you agree to participate in the research?
Yes, I agree.
Thank you. Okay, so then we can just get started and go through the interview questions. And so to start, would you please tell me a bit about your professional background?
Okay, so my professional background, let's see, I got my PhD in political science and specifically public policy here at the University of Oklahoma in 2012. When I completed my PhD, I took on a postdoc position at the Cooperative Institute for Mesoscale Meteorological Studies here at the University of Oklahoma. And that was split between what they call SIMS and the National Severe Storms Lab, which is also here at the University of Oklahoma. So that's a NOAA affiliation. So I did a postdoc for about a year and a half, split between SIMS and NOAA NSSL. And when I finished my postdoc, I took on a research scientist position here at the university in the Center for Applied Social Research, and what then ultimately became the Center for Risk and Crisis Management, which is where I am now. After my brief stint as a research scientist, I took a job as an assistant professor of political science here in our Department of Political Science. And about half of my time I spend as an assistant professor in the department, and the other half I'm the deputy director for research at the National Institute for Risk and Resilience and at the Center for Risk and Crisis Management here at OU.
Very nice. Thanks. When and how did you get involved with research on disasters?
So most of my PhD work was sort of all about research on disasters. I was working with Hank Jenkins Smith here at the university, and his research focuses on risk and public policy. And so I became interested in research on risk generally, but with a focus on disasters at about the same time that I was finishing my dissertation and thinking about what came next. That's when I really kind of became more and more interested in focusing, at least at the time, on natural disasters. Mm-hmm. And so that was probably, almost maybe 10 years ago.
Would you say that you specialize in a certain type of disaster research? Maybe that's a disciplinary specialization, political science, or what would you say?
I would say that I specialize in kind of, like, theoretically, I specialize in the policy-making process, like how do we make and change public policies? And then kind of on the disasters or hazard side, most of my work has focused on tornadoes and severe thunderstorms. But more recently, I've gotten into hurricanes as well.
And is there one seminal disaster event that has really shaped your thinking about disaster research?
There's sort of a one disaster event. It probably really has been two. Right about the same time that I was finishing my dissertation and starting to work closely with folks in meteorology. That was right after the Joplin and Tuscaloosa tornadoes happened in 2011. And in those years, we lost more people to tornadoes than we had in a really long time. And there was quite a bit of fear and confusion among folks in meteorology about whether or not we did something wrong, whether or not this is the new normal. What is the world going to look like after, hundreds of people die from tornadoes in a given year? And so that one was really important. And then in 2013, the Moore tornado, which happened just up the street, I guess I should say, from where we are in Norman, had a pretty big impact on me as well. I got to go out there and participate in some of the damage surveys and sort of see firsthand how disastrous these things can be for some local communities.
Yeah, I was a graduate student at the University of Alabama in 2011.
Oh.
So that's the event that I think did it for me.
I can imagine so.
What was the focus of your research before COVID-19? Did you have any particular project or study going on? And so you could say like prior to March 2020.
So prior to March 2020, most of my research has been, so I should back up. I should say my research is very eclectic. So some of my research relates to disasters. Other portions of my research relate to things like climate change and water policy more broadly. But if I were going to talk mainly about my research on disasters, what I have focused on sort of prior to COVID-19 is how people get information about the weather. Like how do people receive tornado warnings and watches? And how well do they understand that information? And then how does that understanding impact the way in which they protect themselves from those hazards?
Did you have a particular project going on that topic?
Yeah, since about 2015, I've had pretty much continuous funding from NOAA, where we're doing sort of a large-scale evaluation of the watch, warning, and advisory process, where we're trying to collect longitudinal data on the extent to which people across the country actually receive watch and warning products, how many people know what they mean, and then how many people are actually responding to them. And so we've collected those data for NOAA for the last 5 years now.
And what is your mode of data collection for that?
For that, we use primarily surveys, but we've done some mixed method research where we have done in-person experiments with folks like emergency managers, and some research using social media data to supplement the survey research. But most of that is survey research.
Are the surveys online or in person or mailed?
Online.
Online.
Mm-hmm.
So then with COVID-19, has it interrupted that study at all?
It has interrupted the study insofar as it has impacted our ability to collaborate with folks at NOAA headquarters and other researchers on the team. Sort of them being at home and in different places certainly made it a little bit more challenging to design the new surveys and to execute the surveys. It also, COVID-19 interrupted that research because right about the same time, in let's say February to March timeframe, we were supposed to go out into the field with a survey of emergency managers, where we were asking similar types of questions to emergency managers that we asked to members of the public. And, emergency managers became preoccupied at the time with public health issues. And so we really struggled both practically and ethically about whether or not we should be continuing to try to survey emergency managers at the time.
What about, I could see potentially when you're, you know, even the online surveys to your broader sample on watch, warning, and advisory, do you think that COVID-19 and the nature of it with needing to socially distance, do you think it maybe changed people's inputs to your survey, or do you think it had, or maybe you haven't done the data collection this year, or do you think are you having to adopt controls basically for that, or?
We haven't necessarily, well, we have adopted controls insofar as we've asked questions in the survey. And we have seen really interesting changes. For example, people are telling us that because of COVID-19, they're paying less attention to watches and warnings and advisories than they have in the past. And they're telling us, you know, because they have a risk budget, right? People can only pay attention to so many things at once. And if COVID-19 is the thing that you're primarily worried about, you might not be watching the weather as much as you had been watching it before. So we have those kinds of things, and we have people telling us on the survey that, let's say a hurricane were to happen, they're pretty worried that they wouldn't be able to take the same kind of protective actions than they have in the past. In terms of like sort of broader controls, one interesting phenomenon that we've seen is that people are actually a little bit, in contrast to emergency managers, which were really hard to survey and get data from, the public surveys, people have been really eager in some cases to take the surveys. And I think that that's partially because there are a lot of people who are looking for work and ways to supplement their income. And for our panelists, we pay them to complete the survey. And sort of our hypothesis was that there were a lot of people at home looking for easy ways to make money. And so we got a much quicker response than we typically do with some of the online surveys that we've done in the past.
That makes sense. And so what is the nature of your COVID-19 research? What is the focus of it?
So that's a great question. So our research on COVID-19 kind of stems from our work on sort of weather warnings and responses to weather warnings. And in particular, at the beginning stages of our research on COVID, we wanted to understand how people were getting information about COVID-19, if they could make sense of that information, and then make decisions that would protect themselves and others in a way that is consistent with the information that they're getting. So that's kind of how it started, with this sort of basic idea of there's some information that people get, some people understand what it means, other people don't understand what it means, and then some people take protective actions and some people don't, which affects transmission dynamics in different ways. As we got more involved in studying COVID-19, we realized that the information environment is much more challenging than the simple a tornado warning has been issued or a tornado watch has been issued. There's no COVID-19 warning. There is all kinds of information out there about COVID-19. Much of it is true, much of it is false, and some of it's in between, right? And so what our work has kind of morphed into is continuing with this back half, trying to understand information and its effects on behavior, but incorporating a better understanding of the information environment so that we can figure out, A, what types of information are people getting, and then B, to the extent that they're getting misinformation, how that might go on to affect behaviors that relate to disease transmission. Does that make sense?
It does. What are the goals of the study, or how do you expect your findings or hope your findings to be used?
So the big picture goal of the study is to try to figure out how patterns of information flow can affect the transmission of COVID-19. But more specific than that, I think what we're trying to do is, we know that there's a lot of research out there about information and misinformation on things like social media. What we are trying to do is to better understand the extent to which people actually believe the misinformation that's out there, right? So an example being, the president says something about, drinking bleach could potentially reduce your risk from COVID-19, right? We know that there are all these crazy conspiracy theories out there about COVID-19, all of these crazy ideas about things that can be done to protect yourself from COVID-19. What we don't know is how many people have actually been exposed to those theories, how many people actually have heard this random thing that someone has said, and then how many people actually believe it in a way that might affect some of their behaviors. So what we're trying to, I think, better do is connect the information environment to what people actually think, rather than just saying, hey, look, there's a lot of misinformation out there, this is bad. It could be that there's a lot of misinformation out there that either people have never heard or they can pretty easily dismiss, in which case maybe it's not such a big deal.
Mm-hmm.
So that's big picture, what I think that we're trying to get at. Hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah, I think so. I think it's really interesting. A little anecdote. My uncle posted on social media that, wearing the mask was just a Democratic front for Democrats to be able to take away gun control, because you can't have a concealed carry and cover your face. And so he, wouldn't wear a mask unless he's required, basically. And and he ended up getting COVID. He's got it. He's almost through it now, but it's fine.
And that's exactly what we want to know. So we hear these crazy things out there, and we just don't know. Do 80% of people believe this? Is it only 30%? Or maybe it's only 5%, but even so, that 5%, man, they're really vulnerable, because if they believe this, they're going to do some crazy things. And so really what we're trying to do is kind of more thoroughly connect that conspiracy theory, misinformation to sort of the evolution of public beliefs and behaviors.
Based on what I've seen, he's definitely like a one-issue voter, right? So once a theory aligned with his one issue, it had meaning, and so he might filter out misinformation and good information, but then once it aligns with his framework of how, his identity, basically, he latched onto it. That's fascinating. Are there any, it sounds like there are there any particular concepts or theories that are guiding this work? And you said it was building off some prior work. How have you adapted maybe those theories here?
So there's a lot of theories that go into explaining how people make decisions during disasters. I'm sure that you're familiar with like the protective action decision model or protective motivation theory, or some of these other theoretical frameworks that exist. The one that we're using most is protection motivation theory. And that's just kind of the idea that people's threat and coping appraisals can affect the way in which they make decisions about public health, protecting themselves and others. But most of those theories don't account for the sort of modern information environment within which we live. So there's this prior stage that happens before these theories begin, which is that people get information signals from all kinds of places that might then activate them along this chain of protective action decisions. Mm-hmm. And so what we're trying to do is kind of use these back half of these theories that people commonly use to explain decisions, but then kind of infuse that with a better theory about the information environment so that we can understand when and if that information environment can interact to produce perhaps maladaptive behaviors.
And so this part about infusing with theories about the information environment, have you done that before with your tornado or hurricane research, or is it really that's what COVID has required?
That's really what COVID has required. It's made us question some of our previous research. So we've always kind of made the assumption that most of the information that people get is probably quality information, and they're mostly trying to make decisions on the basis of sometimes it's conflicting, but the signal is usually pretty clear. There's the National Weather Service sends a signal that gets filtered through broadcast meteorologists, and then broadcast meteorologists relay that information to people when they make decisions. Mm-hmm. But now, because there's no one sort of source of information with respect to COVID, right? Like you have the president, but you also have the CDC and the WHO, and then all the wackos out there in social media land. All of those things could potentially be sending this signal. And so we're trying to better understand and characterize that. And it has made us think about whether there are ways of understanding information and misinformation in disaster contexts more generally, like with respect to let's say the weather, right? There's some people who put a forecast out 3 months in advance and then say on this day, the temperature high is going to be this and the temperature low is going to be this and it's not going to rain. And we know that that information is not right, but there are people who are putting that out there. And so we have kind of started studying kind of the reverse in other domains on the basis of what we've learned with respect to COVID-19.
So in the COVID-19 research, what are your primary methods that you're using?
So kind of, I guess, depending on how specific you want me to be, I'll tell you, we collect data. So with our COVID-19 research, we are doing weekly surveys of the American public for a year. And before each of those surveys, we systematically analyze information on Twitter to figure out what are the predominant kind of sources of information and misinformation on Twitter that people might have been exposed to, so that we can ask questions about that on the survey. And so,
okay.
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
I was going to say, so you might ask a question about whether someone had heard an existing, something that you saw on Twitter to figure out, what their exposure was.
Exactly. So like every week we comb through. So the Twitter volume on this is crazy. We there's like 30 to 50 million tweets a day about COVID-19. And so we have to figure out a way to sift through that information to try to identify what are some of the bits of misinformation that people might have been most likely to see. And then we create survey questions on the basis of that. And so we have kind of data and methods with respect to the social media side of the project, which are slightly distinct from the data and methods on the survey side of the project.
So yeah, for the Twitter data, it's just like, I don't know, data mining, machine learning. How are you processing it?
Yeah, that's a lot. It's sort of a combination. So what we do is use sort of a combination of network analysis and machine learning to try to identify what some of the core communities are on social media in a given week. Let's say this week there are, really about 12 communities, clusters of people talking about different things. One community is talking about masks and how much they hate masks. Another community, let's say, is talking about the president's recent executive order, and another community is talking about some other thing. So we use a combination of machine learning and network analysis to identify those communities. And then we have some of our research assistants go through and read the top 100 to 200 messages in each of those communities so that we can pull out, using sort of thematic content analysis, what are some of the primary bits of misinformation that infiltrate those different communities.
And then all of your surveys are online?
Yep.
Is that through, like, was it MTurk, or what is it? How are you administering those?
So we develop all of our own surveys, and we administer our own surveys online, but we contract with a company called Qualtrics, who provides us with the sample, the people who take our surveys.
Okay, that was my next question. Yes. Okay, so your samples from Qualtrics.
Yep.
And then, what was I going to ask you about that? Well, I think that's good. Maybe it'll come back to me. Let me read through the interview prompts. Yeah, have you had to make any sort of adjustments to accommodate the circumstances of COVID-19, like potentially losing, access to being on campus in the middle of this, or any type of executive orders that may have come out that have changed anything you've had to deal with, or what maybe your RAs have had to, anything you've had to accommodate during this process?
Yes, a lot of things. So we had our research team at about the same time that we started working on this project. There were a lot of pressures put on our research team from policymaking communities in Oklahoma, asking for advice and guidance on how to more effectively deal with the COVID threat in Oklahoma.
Mm-hmm.
And so we had sort of, at the very beginning of this project, we had to basically decide, where do we focus our time on helping the policymakers deal with the real threat right now, even if that's not necessarily academic research, it helps them make better policies for Oklahoma, or we focus a little bit more on the academic research. And so we ultimately chose to help the policymakers here in Oklahoma, which meant that we had to not pause, but maybe not invest as much time as we otherwise would have in the academic research. And I think that, a lot of folks who do disaster research have the same thing happen to them. Sometimes when disasters happen, you have to temporarily step outside of the academy and do what you can to help people deal with disasters that are at hand. And then you can step back into the academic research. And so that time pressure was probably one of the biggest things that we had to adjust to. We also had to make several adjustments with respect to technology. We had, for example, we've been doing research using Twitter data for quite some time, but never at this volume or scale. And so we had to really seriously amp up our server space and processing power. And that was a little bit challenging because we had to do that all virtually, yet we had to sort of figure out a way to remotely access whatever local resources we had on campus. And so we had to kind of figure out how to handle computational issues. And then the personnel issues, we have 2 research scientists and several graduate and undergraduate students helping us with the project. And some of them, it was, the first project that they've really helped us on. And so we had to figure out a way to kind of work with them and socialize them into the research process all virtually, which was a real challenge.
Mm-hmm. What do you think has been or will be like the primary or the biggest challenge associated with conducting this research?
So I think that the biggest challenge is kind of probably like the methodological challenge, which is kind of what I was saying before about how do you, I mean, our study is really dependent on our ability to accurately and continuously characterize like that information ecosystem on Twitter. And it's just, given the volume of information out there, it's so hard to be confident that in any given week you've caught all of the major important pieces of information.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you don't, then you sort of run the risk of not asking the kinds of questions on the survey that would be required to fully understand everything that people are saying out there.
Yeah, that does sound hard to do.
and all of it, you know, in a week, and you don't really have a lot of time to like sit in the office and talk with people about it. It's kind of you're on Zoom all day, every day.
Yeah, that's what, when you said weekly and then 50 million tweets a day, it looks like this is, you have to stay on. This research is not letting up. Yeah, like you don't have busy, slow weeks. You have only busy.
Right.
You touched on a couple of these items, but let me back up. And so the first, I guess, the question that I wanted to ask you when we were talking about Qualtrics and the sampling is, are you providing compensation for the survey participants?
So yeah, the survey respondents are compensated in accordance with their agreement with the person that they have signed up to take surveys with. And so we don't actually know how much they're being compensated because it varies from person to person depending on the agreement that they've made with their provider.
Have you done that before? Is that similar to what, okay, that's the kind of the same platform that you've used before? Okay.
Yep, that is.
And then you mentioned you'll do the surveys every week for a year. What's the duration of the project?
So the duration of do you mean like the duration of the funding for the project, or the duration of when we expect to kind of have wrapped up the project, including all of the analysis that's going to be necessary and everything?
Let's go with both numbers.
Okay, so the funding, it's an NSF rapid, so it's a year, and I would expect that we would be finished with most of the sort of data collection and writing within about 2 years, probably.
Do you anticipate at this point that you'll try to seek out additional funding to do, spin-off projects or anything?
I hope so. We're writing a couple proposals right now, primarily focused on the NIH, but we have some folks on our team that might be interested in some more research with the NSF or other agencies. So yeah, I do think that we'll probably see if we can't figure out a way to continue at least some version of this into the future.
Mm-hmm. Well, good luck.
Thanks.
And you mentioned some collaborators earlier. And you mentioned like with at least, you said, there's research scientists, undergraduates, some of them are new. Are some of them people you've worked with before?
Yeah. So let me see here. Yes, most of them are folks that I've worked with before. There are 2 new. So I think we have 7 PIs on the project. One of them was a postdoc at the time, and he's a brand new research scientist. So this is his first federally funded project that he's a PI on. I have worked with him in the past, but I also have 2 new PIs on the project that I've never worked with before. One that's in sort of public management and one that's in public health.
So how did you get connected to the new collaborators?
So I've known them. They kind of run around in the same academic circles here at OU, but we've not actually formally worked on a project together until now.
Mm-hmm. So you just maybe reached out to them when this opportunity came up because you were familiar with their name and expertise.
Yeah, and we really wanted no one on none of the folks at at the Center for Risk and Crisis Management, the National Institute for Risk and Resilience. None of us have any expertise in public health. We had all focused primarily on natural and technological hazards. And so the two new people we asked to be part of the team have more expertise and interest in public health. And so that's kind of that's why we asked them to join us.
So it sounds like the answer to this question is no, but what role has Converge played in facilitating your current research?
Converge hasn't really played a big role. I'm familiar with, I know Lori, several of our collaborators sort of are routine attendees at Converge type events, but we haven't had any affiliation with that particular program.
Okay. And so then just a couple of questions left. Much like everyone else, your day-to-day life is probably being affected by the pandemic. What are some changes to your personal life that might be impacting your professional life or your research?
Well, I have a 2-year-old daughter, and for a while she was not able to go to daycare. She has been now able to go back to daycare, but we have pretty strict policies with respect to when we're not sure she's feeling well. So we spend a lot of time at home with her that I didn't spend before. So that's certainly a big change, probably the biggest change. But the other thing is, our lab really functions by working closely and interacting closely with each other, but also with our students and postdocs. And for example, we eat lunch together every day, and we have research presentations every day. And so we spend a lot of time talking to one another about ideas, and it has been a big, big change for us to go virtually. So that's been less fun, but I think we're figuring it out slowly.
In kind of both places, I guess, how have you been coping with these changes?
So with respect to childcare, I think like most people, I just do the best we can and try to sort of balance sort of work life as best I can when my daughter has to be here, and my wife, who's also a full-time academic, when she has to be working on things or at meetings, we have to just switch off. Mm-hmm. In terms of the coping, in terms of interaction, we try. I have weekly meetings with my students. We have weekly lunch meetings where once a week we all kind of go on Zoom and have lunch together and just talk about whatever happens to be going on. So we do those kinds of things, have routine staff meetings, that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm. And then the last question is, to date, what have been the consequences, if any, of the Black Lives Matter demonstrations following the killing of George Floyd on you and your research?
So this is a really good question. Do you mean how it has impacted our COVID research, or like my research generally?
Both.
So it has certainly affected our COVID research insofar as we are much more attentive to issues associated with racial and social justice than we had been in the past. And in particular, we're increasingly interested in how the Black Lives Matter movement and issues associated with policing more generally have led to systematic mistrust for government institutions in some racial communities. And we're seeing that play out in the public health crisis. We're seeing folks of different ethnic and racial backgrounds having different levels of trust in government expertise, be that nationally or even locally, different levels of trust in emergency services and public health services. And that's something that I think we're much more attentive to than we would have been were it not for the Black Lives Matter movement. Mm-hmm. More generally, actually, the Black Lives Matter movement in the killing of George Floyd and others has encouraged us to think more carefully about how concepts like disaster resilience and community mitigation for disasters can themselves build in inequity into systems. And so we're working on a couple projects, one of which is a big NSF ERC project where we're trying to figure out if there's a way to help us better understand how engineering systems, such as where you install levees, how you institute building codes, how you reimburse people for disaster damage, how those things might relate to or reinforce social injustice in society. And so we've been spending a lot of time thinking about how engineering processes themselves can sort of both embed and reinforce patterns of racism in society. So that's definitely something that has had a pretty profound impact on our work.
Yeah. Well, I can keep talking, and I think it's really interesting, everything that you said over the past 45 minutes, but I don't want to misuse your time. So that was the last question, and I appreciate it. I hope that your ERC gets funded. I think that would be fantastic for someone to be studying that at that scale too. But yeah, so thanks for your time today.
You're welcome. Do you guys have a sense of when you might have some like preliminary results? Are you guys going to be able to like reach out to us and let us know kind of how things are looking? I'm really curious to be able to keep track of how you're doing.
Thanks. So what I can do is certainly send you the transcript from our call today in case you want to look over any of it, make sure that your words came off the way you wanted them to and so forth. So I can definitely do that. And, you know, that should be, I don't know, maybe within the next month we would have our transcribing done. And then, I mean, I think, yeah, I don't know that we had a plan of how we would be communicating between now and the next interview request. You know, there's always that trade-off of like wanting to keep you informed versus like overburdening you of like, you told me it was just going to be this 1 hour, now you keep emailing me. So I don't know that we have a plan, but if you want to hear more, I'll just make a note and try to keep you filled in. You know, timeline-wise, is that like this research, our other researchers too, but this research also impacted by COVID. You know, people are busy, so to ask them to, you know, doing their own research is hard enough right now because everything else that they have going on. So then finding the extra time for us is a challenge. So like normally we would do this wave of data collection, I think ideally within 1 week, and we're like spread out across 2 months or something trying to get these interviews done. So I think that just kind of blurs the timeline of like me having a good sense of where we'll be and stuff. And I think we're doing pretty well with response rates, so that's not going to be an issue. But you know, we definitely want to get enough synthesis done to have an intentional kind of targeted second interview, right? Of like knowing where we're headed at that point. So I think if that gives you any sense. And then hard to say, timeline for wrapping up the book, for example. If we do the interviews, say 1 year from today, if the book would be, ready in another year. Feels a little aggressive, but I don't know. Yeah, is that helpful?
Okay, that makes sense. I mean, I think that, like, I've always been kind of interesting in kind of like sort of the philosophy of science and like how science evolves, and it strikes me that you have this interesting issue here where you have this sort of massive scale restructuring of society, which could change the way we think about disasters. And I think you guys being able to document that is just so neat. And so I'll be waiting and watching, and I'm glad to be a part of it.
Well, I appreciate it. And if you want to send anything to like keep us posted about your research or anything like that, definitely feel free to do so. Don't feel obligated, but feel free to do so. And yeah, I'll just make a note to try to give you some updates. You're the only person that's kind of asked about that, so that's where I'm like, I'm not positive. I'm not sure how the others have gotten feedback like that so far, so I'm not positive we would do a communication to all of our respondents, basically, again, to not overburden them, but I can make a note to touch back with you.
Okay. Well, that sounds great. I really appreciate your time, and if there's anything else I can do, just let me know.
Great. Thanks so much. Good luck with all of your research.
Thank you. Well, you as well. Bye.